All right. Thank you very much for having me here. And I want to talk to you about how trade affects the diffusion of knowledge across countries. The canonical view, or the standard view in economics, is that trade facilitates knowledge diffusion. So the intuition there is a bit like this. The country opens to trade that allows firms to be exposed to foreign products. And by looking at those foreign products, the firm can sort of reverse engineer the best technology that are used behind those products. And because the firm figured that out, knowledge flows across countries. And this idea is very important because it has implications to policy and to growth. Because if this is true, then it has to be the case that trade openness leads to economic growth. Then this is another reason for why we should support trade openness. But the problem is that the empirical evidence for this idea is very shaky. So what we know so far is that there is a correlation between openness to trade and the adoption of frontier technologies. And also we know that trade increases firm-level TFP, all right? But the problem with this empirical evidence is that, as we know, correlation is not causation, and trade could increase TFP through many forces. Diffusion is only one of them. Trade also increases innovation. Trade increases the quality of inputs, and all those things would be loaded on TFP. What we want to do in this paper, we want to investigate how trade policy affects the diffusion of knowledge across countries. And we want to isolate knowledge diffusion from these other forces that I just described. And to do that, we're going to study the case of Brazil. So Brazil in the 90s implemented a large trade liberalization. So import tariffs went from around 30% to about 10% nowadays. And I'm going to study two metrics of diffusion. The first one is technology transfers. That sort of measures whose technologies firms are using. So just to have something in mind, when I say technology transfer, think about patent transfers or a technical consulting. I'll be more precise later on what that means. A second metric is patent citations. I'm going to look at whose technologies Brazilian patents are citing when they are published. And what I'm going to show to you is the following. I have two main results. So the first one is that tariffs increase technology transfers from foreign firms to Brazilian firms. The second result is that tariffs also increase the citations that Brazilian firms are making to foreign firms. But that in a very particular group. Tariffs increase citations only to firms that are transferring technology to Brazil. And these citations are being made by firms that are on the same zip code of firms receiving technology transfers. These results have two important implications. The first one is that more trade leads to less diffusion. So here we're increasing import tariffs, we're decreasing trade, and you're increasing diffusion, which is the opposite of what is sort of the canonical view that I showed you before. The second main result is that knowledge diffusion is somehow linked to technology transfers. And I want to give you one concrete example of that. So in the 80s, before the trade liberalization in Brazil, Nippon Steel, which is a large Japanese steel producer, made a technology transfer to Gerdau. Gerdau is a steel producer in the US. That technology transfer had two components. The first one was a set of patents owned by Nippon Steel, and the second one was the application of those patents and those ideas to the production of steel round bars. Basically, Nippon was teaching Gerdau how to produce round steel bars. After that, a few years after that, we observe CSN, which is another steel producer, creating its own line of steel round bars. And that has a set of patents that cites the original Nippon Steel. After the trade liberalization, Nippon has never made another technology transfer to Brazil. And we're going to argue and model that the following way. We're going to take the model by Boer and Oberfield. That's a model of diffusion of ideas through trade. And then we're going to add one trade-off to that model. Firms, they have to choose, foreign firms, they have to choose between transfer technology to Brazil or exporting directly. When import tariffs are high, the profit of exporting directly to Brazil is very low because they have to pay tariffs. Then the profit of transferring technology is relatively higher. So then firms are going to transfer technology. That is great to Brazilian firms because that technology is going to allow them to become more productive, and then it's going to diffuse in Brazil, making more firms even more productive. When the government decreases import tariffs, Nippon Steel would prefer to export directly rather than transfer their technology. And that's bad for Brazilian firms because they don't get to learn. The main implication of that is that if you're going to open up the economy to trade, we need to subsidize technology transfers as well, because those are important for spillovers and diffusion. All right, so let's get deep into how I arrived to those conclusions. And the first thing that I want to say is a bit about the data. So what happens in Brazil that is very interesting is that the patent office and the central bank, they record all international royalty payments associated to improvements in production. How does that work? There are two basically there are two types. One, the first one is royalty payments associated to property right ownership. Those would be patent or trademark transfers. But we have a second group, which is a know-how transfer, which is a knowledge that's not directly protected by intellectual property rights. So they're going to include things such as technical consulting, R&D support, trade secrets, all right? And then what I'm going to do is look how import tariffs in Brazil are affecting these technology transfers. For that, I'm going to use this model. So here, YOST is an outcome of origin country O in sector S in year T. There are two main outcomes here. The first one is the number of technology transfers. And what I'm going to do is going to aggregate those technology transfers in the next 3 years. Why aggregate? Because technology transfers are like an investment. So it's very bumpy. So you cannot look in the current period. And also because it takes time to engage into these agreements, so most likely tariffs are affecting them in the future. So then we're going to aggregate the next 3 years of technology transfers. The second variable is citations. Those are citations made by Brazilian firms in sector S to country O. And then in the right-hand side, I'm going to have the variable of interest, which is the import tariff the Brazilian government imposed against country O, sector S, in year T. Then I'm going to have a set of fixed effects. I'm going to be a sector time fixed effect, whose goal is the following. So the first one, I want to capture productivity shocks, industrial policies at the sectoral level that could correlate with import tariffs. So the first goal is more for identification. The second is to isolate diffusion. Import tariffs affect competition, and competition affects innovation. I don't want to capture that. I want to only capture the citations that are coming from being exposed or not to new ideas. So the sector time fixed effect is going to capture any sort of effect of tariffs that are sector level, such as change in the environment or the competition level. Then I have a country time fixed effect, capturing things such as intellectual property agreements. And the parameter of interest here is the beta. This is the effect of tariffs on diffusion for a particular country sector pair. So the canonical view that I showed you before is that beta should be negative, because you increase import tariffs, that means that you decrease imports, meaning that you decrease learning from foreigners, and then beta is a negative number. That's the canonical view. To get to the causal effect of the tariffs, I'm going to use an instrument. It's come from the literature. If you know what it is, great. If you never heard about it, doesn't really affect that much for the story. Just let's interpret this beta as causal, all right? Okay, so what do we get out of that? The first thing, is that a joke? Serious? All right, all right. Oh, one sentence. All right, I can't. Yeah. All right, okay. So the instrument, the idea is the following. You have two types of import tariffs. You have preferential trade agreements, and you have MFN tariffs. According to WTO regulation, MFN tariffs apply to all members of WTO. The fear is that the government is changing MFN tariffs because of some connection with large partners. So if the Brazilian government expects Chinese IVs or electric cars to become very popular and very productive, it could increase tariffs against electric cars from China ahead of time. So the idea here is to select the sample to only small trade partners, and you're going to make the comparison between preferential trade partners against small MFN trade partners. And the idea is that the change in tariff on small MFN trade partners is exogenous to them. It's just endogenous to the large one. That's the idea. Okay, so what I get out of that? The first result is that tariff increase technology transfers. The first column here, the left-hand side, is the inverse hyperbolic sign of the number of technology transfers. All right, you can interpret that as just as kind of a log. All right, it's a log that accepts 0. The elasticity is interpreted the same way. What the parameter there in red is saying is that if I increase tariffs, if I impose a 100 percentage point tariff against a particular country sector, technology transfers from that country to that sector in Brazil is going to increase by 15%. Column 2 showed the number of different unique technology licensees. So those are the firms receiving technology in Brazil. Column 3 is the number of unique licensors. So those are foreign firms sending the technology. And what I want you to notice in column 2 and 3, that these numbers are very close to what happened in column 1. What that means is that technology transfers are increasing due to an increase in the extensive margin and not the intensive margin, meaning that you have now more firms sending technology to Brazil and more Brazilian firms receiving technology. It's not the same firm receiving more of it. And this is the dynamic effect of that. So in the x-axis, have years to, this is an impulse response function in which I change in the left-hand side. At 0, is the current number of technology transfers. When you go to the right, the positive numbers are years forward. The backwards is years before. We like to look at the backwards because there shouldn't be an effect. And as you can see, there isn't. But after an increase in tariffs, you can see that that leads to an increase in the number of technology transfers, and that peaks at around 5 years and then comes back down. This is the effect of tariffs on the number of citations that Brazilian firms are making. So column 1, again, is the inverse hyperbolic sign of the number of citations that Brazilian firms are making to foreign firms. And what this is saying is that an increase in a 100%, imposing a 100% import tariff leads to a 57% increase in the number of citations by Brazilian firms to foreign firms. The second column shows the effect on a dummy. It takes the value of 1 if that country in particular is cited by the given sector in Brazil. And it shows also tariff also increase the probability of foreign firms to be cited at least once. This is the dynamic effect. And again, there's no trends, and you can see after import tariffs goes up, there's a slightly but surely increase in the number of citations that foreign firms receive. And that peaks at around 5 to 6 years. All right, so the main takeaway here so far is that tariffs increase the number of technology transfers the Brazilian firms received and the number of citations that Brazilian firms make to foreign firms. That suggests that more trade is actually leading to less diffusion. Now we're going to investigate where that's coming from. Here, the left-hand side, I have citations to technology licensors, the first column. So those are the firms sending technology to Brazil. In column 2, citations to firms that have never sent any technology to Brazil. What I want to get from this table is that only citations to technology licensors are being affected by import tariffs. In this column, we look at the location of these firms making these citations. Column 1 shows the effect of import tariffs on citations to foreign firms, but they are made by firms which are on the same zip code of firms that received a technology transfer. Column 2 shows the effect of tariffs on citations made by firms that are on different zip codes of those that have received the technology transfer. What I want you to notice is that the effect is much larger on firms that are on the same zip code of those receiving technology transfers. The same is true in column 3 and 4 when we look at different or same city of firms receiving technology transfer. So what this suggests so far is that there is a connection between citing foreign firms and someone nearby you receiving technology transfer. The conventional wisdom that trade leads to the diffusion of ideas implies that firms that are connected to international trade should be the ones making the citations to foreign firms. We're going to test if that is true. Column 1 and 2 breaks down the effect of tariffs on citation by firms that receive technology transfers in column 1 and firms that didn't receive technology transfers. Most of the effect is on firms that didn't receive technology transfers. Column 3 and 4 look at importers. All the effect is coming from firms that are not importing inputs from foreign firms. So they have no connection, direct connection to international trade. Column 5 and 6 look at exporters, and they show that most of the citations that are increasing are by firms that are not exporting to foreign markets. This suggests that connection to foreign markets is not an important variable to understand diffusion of technologies after an increase in tariff. All right, let me skip this. And what we have so far. So it seems that tariff is increasing the knowledge diffusion across countries measured by the technology transfer and citations. And this increase in citation is related to technology transfers, because what's being cited are technology being transferred to Brazil, and these citations are made by firms that are on the same zip code of firms receiving technology transfers. What we want to do now, all right, let me skip that as well because I have 2 minutes. What I want to do now is to understand how important this effect is in aggregate. So for that, I'm going to take a model by Buer and Oberfield, and going to add sort of 2 important elements. So the first element is that foreign firms face a trade-off between transferring their technology directly to Brazil or exporting. And the second important insight of the model is that Brazilian firms, they can learn from exporters or they can learn from technology transfers. But the rate at which they learn is different. So then what happens in this model is that when you increase import tariffs, that's going to lead firms to increase technology transfers, simply because exporting directly to Brazil just became more expensive. And that's going to increase diffusion if firms learn more from technology transfers than they learn from firms exporting to Brazil. What we're going to do to calibrate this model is very simple. We're going to reproduce the same regressions that I showed you before on the model. You're going to run the same regressions on the model. You're going to calibrate the model parameters to generate two particular moments in the data, which is first the effect of tariffs on the number of technology transfers and the effect of tariffs on citations. All right? Let's see what this model delivers. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to go through details, but I can show you some nice figures. So here, in the x-axis, I have years to the trade liberalization. And I'm reproducing on the data the same type of import tariff change that I observed happening in Brazil. At 0 is when import tariffs decrease. And here what I'm plotting is the welfare gains, the consumption of households in this model. When you reduce import tariffs, consumption goes up because things just became more cheaper. But as you can see, over time, the consumption decreases. What's happening here is that now firms are exporting directly to Brazil rather than licensing their technology, and Brazilian firms are missing on all this learning. And this is why, in the long run, they lose. And this is what happens when you liberalize the economy together with a subsidy to technology transfers. So in the blue line is just what I showed you before, no subsidy. But in the green line is a subsidy with a subsidy to technology transfer. And in the red line, in the red line is just the subsidy to technology transfers. Because you have to pay the cost of subsidizing some firms, in the short run, at 0, you lose because you're having the cost but not the benefits. But over time, as you get more and more technology transfers, Brazilian firms learn more and more from foreigners, they become more and more productive, and then you start getting massive gains from technology transfers. And those gains are even larger if together with that, you open the economy. All right, I showed you this picture before. I think this is maybe how many of us used to think about trade and the diffusion of ideas. What I want to bring to the table is that maybe that's not the full picture. What we find to be happening in Brazil is that when we increase import tariffs, firms are going to transfer their technology to Brazil rather than exporting directly. And that's great because diffusion's ideas are going to diffuse. And that has important implications to policy, because that means that then we should subsidize technology transfers when we think about trade openness and trade liberalization. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gustavo. We do have time we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. So, Gustavo, can we collect 3 or so and then respond? Okay. And let's try and be aware if you've asked questions before, maybe I'll try to get people who haven't asked questions. Marnie, and then Rodrigo, and then Tim. Sorry. Marnie, yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marnie. I'm a PhD candidate here. I think this was on the slide that you skipped, but I'm interested in why you think this is different than tariff hopping using FDI. And that's it. That's my whole question. Thank you.
Okay. Then I said Rodrigo. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Rodrigo. I'm a PhD student at the University of Maryland. A question. I understand that there are effects from additional effects from clustering from your additional checks, but I wanted to understand a bit better the dynamics that you mentioned when you're separating or looking specifically at small trade partners. You mentioned something about that. What is actually the dynamic there? Do you consider balances of power between large companies and weaker governments? Brazil is obviously a large market with strong institutions and a strong government, but what would happen if we looked at a slightly different power dynamic between large multinationals with very strong headquarter operations in terms of IP and technology and R&D, and their willingness or their ability to skew this relation that you find in the data?
Yeah, Tim Sahai from Johns Hopkins. The question is, how is the ideas actually diffusing without a human capital policy from the government? So are they increasing the absorptive capacity by creating universities, science industry links, and actually trying to increase the knowledge base so that they can actually absorb that technology in that sector? And relatedly, if so, which sectors do you see the largest sort of gains in knowledge transfer?
Okay, Gustavo.
Great questions. Okay, I will answer the first two together because they're sort of related. FDI. Okay, so is this different than FDI? And why is this paper not about FDI? So let me answer why this paper is not about FDI. That's because FDI is not affected. So this slide that is kept showed the effect of these import tariffs on FDI, and I showed that import tariffs are not really moving the amount of FDI made in Brazil or the ownership structure of these firms. Why has that happened? Well, maybe Brazil is not such a large market for many of these firms. We think that the fixed cost of making FDI or doing business in Brazil may be very large, and this is why these firms decide not to move in. But the real point is that I do not find any effect in FDI. So how is this different than FDI? And now I'm speculating a bit. I believe that you're making technology transfer, so you are letting someone else handle your knowledge and your technology, and that person has access to it for 5 years. I would imagine, they're going to take less care of your knowledge than you would. So my guess is that technology transfers, they diffuse more because of that than, a traditional FDI. But if you just, if you're curious about the model, if you relabel the model technology transfer to FDI, it will be all the same. But my gut instinct is that you should calibrate the model differently. All right, the third question that Tina asked. So how is technology diffusing and what sectors are they diffusing the most? It's interesting and it's related to what you said. The sectors that are getting more technology diffusion are the ones that were innovating more and that have hired more PhDs before. How is technology diffusing in practice? The honest answer is I don't know. I have tried empirically finding different ways. Other than the regional one that I showed you, it doesn't seem that I can find much explaining the diffusion aspect. It doesn't seem like workers moving across firms is part of the story. What really seems to be part of the story is how much innovation the firm was already doing, or the sector were already doing when tariffs went down. That seems to be matter a lot.
Great. We're unfortunately out of time, so let's move. Thanks very much, Gustavo.